So, good day. I'm Ron Pren, the director of the MIT Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar that features the public release of the Joint Program's 2021 Global Change Outlook. That is a result, in this case, of 3 years of concerted effort focused on the challenge of reducing climate risk. There's no doubt that the risks resulting from human-induced climate change are among the most serious facing the world today. These risks demand urgent action, and science can help substantially to inform and alleviate risk. To minimize these risks, the Paris Agreement aims to commit nearly 200 nations to implement greenhouse gas emissions reduction policies consistent with keeping the increase in the global average temperature since pre-industrial times to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and to pursue efforts to further limit that increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. A significant body of research, including our own, indicates that the first set of submitted near-term Paris pledges, these are known as nationally determined contributions or NDCs, these are a good first step, but inadequate by themselves to put the globe on track to meet the above long-term targets. Hence, to avoid the worst consequences of climate change, the Accord calls for participating nations to strengthen their NDCs over time. To that end, the United States and a few other nations have recently announced more stringent emissions reduction goals for 2030 at the virtual climate summit convened by President Joe Biden in April. To support the decision makers now engaged in or impacted by the ongoing international effort to stabilize the climate, the Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change is now releasing its 2021 Global Change Outlook. Based on a rigorous, integrated analysis of present and future climate change, population and economic growth, technological change, Paris NDC's evolution, COVID-19 impact, and many other factors, the report presents the Joint Program's latest projections for the future of the Earth's energy, food, water, and climate systems, as well as prospects for achieving the Paris Agreement's short and long-term climate goals. For the first time, the Outlook explores two well-known sets of risks posed by climate change. Research highlighted in this report indicates that elevated climate-related physical risks will continue to grow by mid-century, along with heightened transition risks that arise from shifts in the political, technological, social, and economic landscapes that are likely to occur during the transition to a low-carbon economy. Following my introduction, the webinar will feature presentations by the Joint Program Deputy Directors, Dr. Sergei Poltsev and Dr. Adam Schlosser. These are the two lead authors of the 2021 Outlook. Their presentations will be followed by a Q&A session moderated by the Joint Program's Executive Director, Anne Slin. Anytime during the webinar, please use the Q&A button on your screen for entering questions regarding the presentations as you are seeing them, or more generally about the Outlook. I emphasize that we really want to hear from you, the audience, our guests, and we therefore plan to leave about 40 minutes for the Q&A session, plus or minus. I now hand over to Dr. Sergei Poltsev for his presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ron, for the introduction. As Ron has mentioned, the Outlook is a product of many researchers and many contributors. So here is my thanks to the team at the MIT Joint Program who has put our signature publication to this shape and form. And we are really hoping that our Outlook is going to help the decision makers, industry leaders, academia, NGOs, with providing them with the data for making good decisions. Because you cannot have good strategies without good data. And that's the real reason behind our Outlook, to provide our view, to provide the data where we see the world is going. So what is our Outlook? Those of you who are familiar with the output of our program, they know that this is what we call our signature publication. and it's the 7th edition of the Outlook. We have started producing this Outlook in 2012, where we are providing our view where the world is going. It's not necessarily the statement where we want the world to be, because definitely we want to see the emissions reduced as fast as possible in a coordinated manner. Unfortunately, that's not the case yet. And so what are these projections? They are not the exercises how to get to net zero by 2050 or 2035 or any other date, but rather our view where the world is currently going and where we see the prospects for achieving the Paris Agreement targets, both in the short term, as Ron has mentioned, those nationally determined contributions for 2030, but also for reaching the longer term targets, keeping temperature below 2 degrees. And this is our outlook for energy, managed resources, and climate. So immediately, I want to stress, in comparison to our previous outlooks, well, what did we find? What is the new in the 2021 outlook? Well, first of all, as Adam Schlosser will report later, we will see that unfortunately we are finding that the impacts from climate change are getting more severe. We are finding more extreme events. And even though in the outlook, we are providing only partial look at the climate impact. So we are not pretending that we can quantify all the impacts in a comprehensive manner. Rather, they are focusing on the water issues, on agriculture, on land use. But even looking at these components, we are finding that we unfortunately are getting into the situation where we are going to feel those impacts. And again, Adam is going to expand more. Just I'll provide the statement which definitely get my attention, that half of the world population will undergo stress on water supply by 2050. We also confirm that we are not on target. And again, that's not so good news, that where we are, where the current trajectory of the emissions, we know that without aggressive actions, the world will surpass the GHG concentration thresholds for Paris Agreement targets. And that's not going to happen somewhere in the distant future. We see that we are going to pass those in the coming decades if we are not going to change the actions much more dramatically. We also find very good news, although, as I have stated, the cost of inactions are higher. Well, it looks like in comparison to our previous assessments, we are finding that the cost of action are more manageable. It's still not without the cost, but it looks like thanks to dramatic reduction in the costs of wind and solar and other technologies, but mostly wind and solar, we can achieve much more aggressive targets. And as a result, in this outlook, we put those aggressive targets as they are advocated by numerous governments in many countries. So those of you who are familiar with the previous editions of the outlook, we were focusing on the scenario which we call Paris Forever. And I'll explain in a moment what that means. But in this edition of the outlook, we actually providing 3 scenarios where we are also looking how to get from Paris, so how to change that forever into 2-degree target. And also we are looking at the accelerated action scenario. Immediately following that statement that you cannot have good strategies without good data, we provided the main results for 18 EPA regions in the 3 Excel files for every scenario. They are available on the Outlook website. So I encourage you to take a look and study those numbers and let us know where you agree or disagree with this. So achieving aggressive climate targets will reduce the impacts of climate change. And again, Adam Schlosser is going to expand on that. I also encourage you to go and explore our visualization dashboard. In the Outlook webpage, you will have a link to this website, the publicly available website, where you can explore the details behind the scenarios, again, by the EPA regions, by emission and climate category, by the energy and economic category. And again, I invite you to explore our Outlook numbers, and we are hoping to hear from you with more details and where you agree with the results, and more importantly, where you disagree with the results, because this is how we learn, how we go into the future research, where we need to improve our system of projections. So to begin with these scenarios, as I already have explained, we are focusing in the Outlook on 3 scenarios. We start with the Paris Forever, where in the Paris Forever, we looking at the current NDCs, which we hope are going to be improved and which we hope that they are going to be updated, and especially after the meeting in Glasgow, hopefully we are hoping to see for more aggressive actions, not only from the countries which already announced about that, but also from additional countries. And I'll also talk about that briefly in a moment. So the Paris Forever current as of March of 2021, and I'll explain why it's important to state that it's in the March of NDCs, and we keep those pledges after 2030 unchanged. So if country is pledging to change the energy intensity or emission intensity, we keep those targets. If country is pledging to reduce emissions to a particular target, we keep those targets. So that's the world where we get to NDCs from Paris and keep those pledges forever. Then the Paris 2 degree is the same, but after 2030, we are changing the trajectory where we are reaching 2 degree scenario target with 50% probability. In a separate study, which I'll reference, we also have explored alternative 2 degree target with 66% probability of reaching. And then on top of that, we looked at the accelerated action scenario. This is where we already included those NDCs which are announced in April 2021. And also we expanded some of the other announcements all the way to 2050 in order to make sure that we are in a trajectory which is consistent with reaching 1.5 degree scenario with 50% probability. So just to make sure what we put as April targets. So as I'm sure all of you are aware, the United States has announced new targets after rejoining the Paris Agreement of reducing their emissions by 50 to 52% relative to 2005. So that's much more aggressive target in comparison to what was announced before. Also, Canada, Japan updated their targets. Korea has announced that they will do that later, so we didn't put that into this outlook. But we also followed the China announcement that they're actually going to reduce coal production faster than it was announced before. So that accelerated actions is our hope, where the country are going to get more and more aggressive in terms of the emission reduction. So this figure is providing you the outcome of these scenarios in terms of the global greenhouse gas emissions. As you can see, well, now we are making projections all the way to 2150. So we are not ending at 2100 as before, but expanding that for 50 more years to see the temperature impacts for this expanded projection period. And so you can see that, at least based on our representation in the integrated global system model in terms of the emission profiles, we are not really at net zero by 2050 in order to reach 1.5 degree, but still quite aggressive emission reduction actions needed. Also note that we put the impact of the COVID into our Paris Forever scenario, and it does have some impacts, but COVID by itself is not going to change the emission trajectory. So the ultimate goal, what we are trying to get, is to understand the question, what are the risks? How to make sure that we are making decisions in the uncertain future? And Adam is going to expand on the results in terms of the temperature, but I just want to bring your attention to this communication tool which we are promoting at the joint program, which we call Greenhouse Gamble Wheel. And so the wheel on your left is that Paris Forever scenario. So those are the temperature out which we see after running our 400-member ensemble of our climate model. And the wheel of the right is that scenario Paris to 1.5 or accelerated actions which leads to 1.5. And definitely we are going to have very different future. We're not sure where exactly we are going to land, but we see by the shapes, these pies, the probabilities where we are going to end up. And definitely you can answer that question by yourself, but if you want to spin the wheel on your right, more action is needed, more investments are needed. And so that requires in a very different approach and different impacts and different costs for spinning that wheel on the right. And so in the remaining time, I'll try to elaborate on the energy side, what that means. Or another point which I want to make is in the Excel files, we are providing the results for the EPA regions. EPA is our economic model. So all the results are provided for 18 regions. In the text of the Outlook, you have noticed that we are combining those regions into different groups. So some of the figures are combined into these three different groups: developed regions, other G20s, and rest of the world. And we start with global drivers. We start with the latest projections from the United Nations population divisions. And immediately you can see that where the population growth is going to happen. And you can see that, the developed world is going to have more or less constant population. Other G20 has initial increase due to China and India, but it's really rest of the world where the current assessment of the population projections is telling us this is where going to be the growing population. So it's Africa, Southeast Asia. So those countries which currently do not have that much access to the energy and also which do not have that much income as depicted on your figure on the right, which provides you the figure for global GDP, where the increase in income going to happen. You can do a very simple exercise, divide by one by another in order to get the income per capita or GDP per capita. And you can see that we still have a lot of catching up to do, and still the less advanced regions still have a lot of work in order to catch up in terms of the income per capita to get to the levels of the developed world. We looked at the impact of the COVID. We found that, yes, indeed, the COVID is going to put us into a different trajectory, but not that much different trajectory. So we see that it's going to impact both GDP, global GDP and regional GDP, and also going to impact the energy. And we are seeing the consistent impact of about 2 to 4%. So this is the story in terms of the global primary energy in these three scenarios. So what I'm going to draw your attention to is that dark blue color on the top, which are renewables, wind and solar. And definitely you can see that, they're expanding in every scenario. So if you are trying to make investment, this is your safe bet. So renewables are going to grow in any scenario. So that's a very good news if you are trying to push more for wind and solar, because that's a good strategy. But they are going to expand much more with more aggressive actions. And you can see that the share of fossil fuels is reducing by 2050 in these scenarios. So in Paris Forever, it's about 70%. In Paris 2 degree, we are getting to about 50% for fossil fuels. And in accelerated actions, we still have fossil fuels. So we are not eliminating them in our projections, even by 2050. But share drops substantially. And one of the areas where we see more action is needed is oil, is transportation, is that use of oil for industrial purposes and transportation. This is where we see more aggressive action needed because we see that staying for quite a while in the system. So in terms of the global electricity production, obviously, the picture is even more optimistic, even more positive for the renewables. So in the scenarios where we have those aggressive actions, we are getting about 70 to 80% of the global power generation powered by the renewables. So we are really pushing coal out of the system, that gas, which we see some of that with CCS. But it's really renewables which we are going to rely upon. And so that strategy of electrify everything and try to make electricity as carbon neutral as possible with wind and solar, that's a good strategy. And we are confirming that that's indeed where we see the world is going. Also, a lot of action on the electrifying private transportation. Well, with a somewhat surprising result that even with all that growth, we are not at 100% electric in 2050 globally. And I'm stressing that globally. And we see that it's still going to be a lot of pushes. It's still going to be a lot of development and improvement in batteries, which are required to make electric cars competitive in all segments where light-duty vehicles are employed. But the challenge is quite dramatic. We need to grow from about 10 million fleet of the global electric vehicles to more than 1 billion in a very short period of time. And while we will see with these announcements by major car makers that they're going to switch to electric cars, but globally, that's still a big challenge. And you can see that while just focusing on the private transportation segment already tells you how big of the challenge it's going to be, especially if you're going to consider the elements, the batteries, the minerals which are needed for this transition. What gives some room for the optimism is this trajectory from the sales of electric cars from the last year. So the blue bars shows you the global sales of electric cars month by month in 2019. The orange bars shows you the same information for 2020. So what we have noticed that in the first 6 months of 2020, global sales of electric cars were down. So it's about 15% less electric cars was sold. But then something has happened. Germany and France have doubled their support to electric vehicles. And so as a result, you can see that the sales were increasing dramatically. Similarly, China extended its support. Not so much action in the US, but also the numbers were not dropping down in the US, again, to support of some categories of the electric vehicles. The dynamic to watch is among these 1.4 million EVs sold in Europe. Actually, in 2020, 5% of them were China-made. It almost 0% before. So something to watch about the reorientation, who is going to be the major car producers, and again, who is going to have advantage of the materials and batteries and so on. So it's something to watch how geopolitics of all this transition is going to take up, and we can get that into Q&A period. Another point which I want to make is that we have done a study where we looked at the transition risks and physical risks related to climate change. And Adam is going to go more in detail in terms of the transition risks, in terms of the physical risk, in terms of the transition risk. We looked at values of the fossil fuels which are not going to be developed in these scenarios. And we try to estimate what is the economic value of these fossil fuels. We found that the number is huge. So the $17 trillion in these assets which are not developed between the two scenarios, actually more than the current GDP of China. And it's slightly less than the US GDP. So it's a big, big number. A lot of caveats around that number, obviously, because we are measuring that as a difference between scenarios. So it's not really the stranded assets if the companies with forward-looking behavior are changing their behavior. So these losses hopefully are not going to be realized by other strategies which companies are going to employ. And actually, we are involved in the project with Bank of Canada, where we're helping them with these scenarios where they're asking their financial institution to do the stress tests against these scenarios by using the numbers from our economic models and try to check, are their holdings really prone to these transition risks? And so this is my concluding slide on the managed resources, on the energy. Well, we also look at the impacts on the global food production, agriculture, on land use. And so what we have found that agriculture and food production are going to keep growing because, well, the population is growing and it will increase the pressure on land use, on water use, on use of energy-intensive inputs into agriculture, including fertilizers. And so that actually is going to lead to even higher greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, which means that we need to do even more action everywhere else. And so another dynamics is as population getting richer, getting higher income, the diets are changing. And we also tracing that composition of the protein-rich food diets as income rises, and you can see that the dynamics in different regions actually different in our projections. And so from here, I'm going to switch on these impacts to physical side, how the water requirements, how the land requirements and other issues are impacted in these scenarios. So I'm going to switch to Adam. So Adam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sergey. And thank you, Ron, for your opening remarks. I am going to hopefully get my screen shared here shortly. There we go. So regret the delay there. So just to continue on with Sergey's presentation, and particularly just focusing on the direct connection between all of the transformations that he's highlighted in the energy system and how that directly relates to the climate response. It really comes down to the emissions and then the subsequent change in concentrations of the trace gases that we know are important in regulating the climate system. And in this case, interfering with the climate system in terms of the human influence. So what you're looking at here is a summary of our projections of one of the most important trace gases that we have on the planet, which is carbon dioxide. And in these slides, you're essentially looking at the trajectories of our key scenarios, the Paris Forever and the two aggressive mitigation scenarios. And hopefully what you see right away is one very important takeaway message, which is in our Paris Forever scenario, essentially by design of how we've set it up, but I think it's still a very important point to make, is that this is not a stabilization scenario. All indications are that concentrations of not just CO2, but our other important trace gases will all rise through the century into the 22nd century. There are some very important milestones along the way that this trajectory makes. There has been considerable attention about limiting CO2 concentrations or CO2 equivalent concentrations to 450 parts per million. The Paris Forever trajectory goes by that by the mid-century and continues to rise. We do find that in our aggressive mitigation scenarios that we are seeing this savory outcome of a stabilization. And again, this is by design, but what is important to note is that over the next 10 years or the next decade, all of these scenarios don't really show any distinct behavior. It is really going into the 2030s in which all of these trajectories diverged quite distinctly. And the actions, again, that are needed to meet the climate target, or again, in the Paris Forever scenario, just to continue on the commitments that have been made with the Paris Agreement continue. All of these result in very dramatic and distinct changes by the 2030s. So we have about 10 years until we see, or we will require the world to make some dramatic changes to meet these emissions trajectories and concentration trajectories. So how do these translate into global temperature response? As Sergey has mentioned, our framework allows for a probabilistic approach. Why do we need a probabilistic approach? Well, we, as good as our models are and as good as our observations are of the climate system, there is still a substantial amount of uncertainty in how we view the climate system, how we project the climate system, and how we think the climate system is going to respond. There are uncertainties in the cloud response, there are uncertainties in the ocean response, there's uncertainties in how aerosols affect the climate. And given observations, we're able to constrain our Earth system model and then sample all of these uncertainties in a probabilistic monocolor way and give us these distributions. So what you're looking at here, again, are distributions of our temperature response at a global scale while incorporating all of these uncertainties. Similar to the previous slide, you're seeing the Paris Forever scenario on the left and our more aggressive mitigation scenarios on the right. Some important takeaways. 2 degrees global warming has been recognized as a very important climate target to achieve, not only in the Paris Accord and in many of the international climate change projection and climate change mitigation efforts, but it has been recognized as one that has with it a lot of climate risk consequences at a more granular and local scale. In our Paris Forever scenario, again, given all of the uncertainties that we've incorporated into these model projections, there is essentially no chance, as far as we can tell, there is virtually no chance of us achieving that 2-degree target by the end of the century. The entirety of our distribution, of our projection distribution, exceeds 2-degree warming by the end of this century. There is some likelihood that we will stay below 2 degrees Celsius going into the middle of this century. But again, in terms of this Paris Forever scenario not being a stabilization target, we will eventually exceed that warming. As Sergey mentioned, given the other 2 mitigation scenarios that we've constructed, and by design, we do see that we are able to achieve the 2-degree warming target, as well as even a more aggressive global warming target of 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. We are able to achieve that, even given all of the uncertainties in the climate response and all the transformations that are going to be required in the energy system. What is interesting to see, though, is in the 2-degree scenario that we have, again, since we have a lot of uncertainties that we have to account for, it's a 50-50 probability. So in amongst the entirety of the distribution of our projections, 50% of our members achieve or below 2-degree warming, while 50% of it exceed that. What is encouraging is that if we were to adopt or try to strive for a world where we will achieve a 1.5 degree global warming target by the end of the century, even amidst all of the uncertainties that we have, that 1.5 degree scenario will, with very high probability, also almost guarantee us that we will achieve a 2-degree warming target by the end of the scenario and remain that way going into the 22nd century. With precipitation change, there are a very well understood physical basis that with a global temperature rise, there is a concurrent global precipitation rise. There's a lot of studies done in the climate modeling community that suggest and that indicate that with a degree of warming globally, you can expect about a 2 to 3% increase in global precipitation globally. Our IGSM, our Earth System Modeling Framework, aligns with that hydrologic sensitivity, if you will. So again, with every degree of warming within our Earth System model, we also see about a 2 to 3% increase in global precipitation. And what these figures are showing you is, again, the associated global precipitation rise along with the global temperature rise that we see in all of our scenarios. A couple of important takeaways. On the right, you're seeing on the left, you're seeing the Paris Forever scenario. And what it is showing us is that by mid-century, again, with this global hydrologic sensitivity, we will expect a rise in precipitation. There is some uncertainty associated with that. But in the sort of the central tendency of that simulation, there is an amount of water that will be delivered from the sky, essentially, that exceeds the current global annual human water consumption. So that's a lot of precipitation, additional precipitation. Again, it's a small fraction of what's coming out of the sky now, but it is a substantial amount when you think about how much water humans use right now. Now, what we'll show in subsequent slides is that even though that is a lot of water, it's not delivered to everyone everywhere that needs water. So there's an important consequence to the precipitation increase as it relates to our needs for water as a resource. In terms of the global precipitation increase, you might ask, and we've mentioned this before, about the issue of climate risks and extreme events. Extreme events is a very granular and very local issue. It requires a lot of detailed modeling for any particular place or system of interest to do a lot of detailed modeling. However, there is a lot of supporting model-based evidence and analysis that can associate a global precipitation change to at least a range of what would be the concurrent changes in extreme and heavy precipitation associated with that global precipitation increase. And the evidence suggests right now that whatever global precipitation increase you find in a global climate model, there's approximately a 5 to 10 times increase in heavy and extreme precipitation that is associated with that global precipitation increase. So for example, if you look on the right-hand slide, I have included not just the absolute changes, but also the relative changes in global precipitation. And so again, by this sort of back of the envelope calculations, the 3 to 6% increases that you see in these global precipitation increases would suggest, again, from other climate modeling studies that have been done, it would suggest that you could see anywhere from about a 15 to 50% increase in some of the more heavy and severe and extreme precipitation events that would occur locally and regionally. And again, that would threaten, would result in increased flood risk to a number of our systems that are at threat. The important takeaway here is that when we look at the Parish Forever scenario, we see a fairly, again, as I mentioned, a very substantial increase in the global precipitation response. In the 2 degree and 1.5 degree scenario, what we are finding is that these mitigation scenarios can cut that global precipitation increase by half or even a third when we consider the aggressive actions, the Parish 1.5 degree scenario. So mitigation works. It can really cut away a lot into the associated climate risks that we know are going to occur with human force change. It doesn't completely eliminate them, but it goes a long way into cutting some fairly substantial and considerable risks to the climate system. So a lot of the work that we've looked at or that we've shared with you so far has been at the global scale. So the important issue here is that we have to take these global results and bring them down to some sort of a regional and local granularity. We have developed a procedure, a hybrid procedure, and have used this for about the past 10 years, where we have used our global temperature and global precipitation and other global variables and have drawn from information from the coupled model intercomparison projects, CMIP projects, that are associated with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessments. We've looked at those models, and what we've been able to do is to extract emerging patterns of response in these key atmospheric climate variables. And what I'm showing you here is just an example of what we see for temperature. There's a lot going on here, but the big takeaway message that hopefully you can all see is that the shades of red that you see are telling you that for a global temperature response, these are the areas that see a relatively higher temperature increase compared to the global temperature response. And what you hopefully see here is that many of the land areas are going to be warmer than whatever the associated global temperature response is. And that's an important result, particularly when we're thinking about climate risk. This is a very well-recognized pattern. It's called the COWL pattern, C-O-W-L, colder ocean, warmer land. We've seen this not just in the latest version of the CMIP model results. We're using the CMIP phase 6 model results, but we've seen that in all earlier versions of the CMIP model based investigations all the way back to CMIP phase 3, which we started this procedure. And in addition to temperature, we do this with other variables, with precipitation. Precipitation doesn't show the same features as temperature in that you don't see this sort of global land-wide response. But what you are seeing is that in the deeper shades of orange and red, these are indicating areas where, for a given precipitation change, these are, relatively speaking, drier precipitation trends than what you're seeing for the global precipitation trend. So in many cases, the areas that you see in deep orange and red are actually drying, even though the global precipitation is increasing. And that has some important consequences when thinking about climate risk. This slide here is just summarizing some of the key points when thinking about that hybrid method, which is in one case, when you think about temperature, because of that cowl pattern, even though you might have a global target of 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, when you look at any large continental region and you look at the area mean temperature response, in none of the continents that we've looked at, with the exception of maybe just one or two, in most of the continents, they are not able to achieve a 2 degree or 1.5 degree warming target simply because of this cowl pattern. There are some moderate exceptions to that, which is in South America, there seems to be a little bit more of a likelihood that it could achieve that target. But by and large, in most continental regions, this cowl pattern is a very important consequence when thinking about a global climate target and how it relates to a local response. There are also some important consequences in looking at those precipitation patterns. One of which is that when you look at the continental regions, the responsive precipitation over land areas suggests that in the winter months, you typically see wetter conditions, wetter winters, wetter cold seasons. But in the summer months, the warmer periods, you tend to see drier summer conditions. So what happens here is sort of a double threat, is that in the colder seasons, these tend to be more flood-prone conditions. But in the summertime, in the warmer months, in addition to the enhanced warming, you're also seeing a precipitation trend that is promoting more of a drier season. And this has some pretty important consequences, not only when you think about food production, to Sergey's points, but when we just think about global water stress. We have a model that we run with these global projections that looks at water stress. We consider two different forms of water stress, environmental and societal. Environmental is essentially just trying to gauge a basin's need for water against the ability for nature to replenish the water supplies. Societal water stress is basically just trying to assess, well, each basin has a certain amount of water needs. Can we deliver all the water to those various water demand sectors? And so we track these stresses, and then for every basin, we look at how many people live in the basins. And in these slides here, what we're showing is just essentially how many people globally are exposed to these water stress indicators. On the left, you're looking at the global trajectories for the Paris Forever scenario. And what we see is a fairly monotonic rise in both of these stress indicators. And in addition, if we think about the basins where both of these stresses are concurrently happening, we see also a similar monotonic rise. And by the middle of the century, what we find is that more than half the population will be living in basins that experience societal water stress, so that they will not be able to meet the demands, that the water supplies will not be able to meet the demands across all the water sectors. And when thinking about the Paris Forever scenario and thinking about how effective mitigation is, we find actually a really important result here is that even in our most aggressive mitigation scenario, the 1.5 degree or the aggressive action scenario, this only reduces the combined water stress trends by about 10%. And when we think a little bit more about what we're doing in the model and how we're projecting a lot of the drivers of water stress. Population growth is a gorilla in the room. And what we find out is that even if we just consider all the basins now that are under stress and we just apply our population projections, that accounts for about half of the increase in water stresses that we're seeing. So what is that saying? What it's saying is that even under the most aggressive, the most aggressive climate change or climate mitigation prevention that we could think of, there is still about half of the increases in water stress that are unavoidable. And these have to be met with some form of global scale, widespread adaptation measures that deal with water efficiencies and somehow ways to improve our storage capacities and think about ways of being better stewards and better shepherds of our water resource systems. In thinking about where these basins that would require the most serious attention of these adaptive measures, we've also put together a water stress indicator. And what you're seeing here is basically just a shade of shades of these indicators, where a value of 6 is indicating where we feel are high priority basins, not only again for the increases in stress that we see under our scenarios, but again, thinking about this unavoidable risk. And when you put all this together and thinking about all of our scenarios out to mid-century, probably the biggest takeaway message that we could convey is that worldwide, 3 out of every 10 people are going to be living in basins where both societal and environmental pressures will be experienced. And again, a lot of that, at least half of that, is going to be unavoidable when it comes to just thinking about these climate mitigation issues. And they have to be met with adaptation measures. So again, to just summarize everything, we hopefully, with everything that we've shared with you today, you've hopefully gotten the very clear takeaway message that in all of our scenarios, the world will need to transform its energy systems considerably. What is compelling to see also is that even under the most aggressive transformations, we're still going to see fossil fuels in our future. There's a very good indications that renewable energy will become a dominant source of power, or will need to by mid-century in our more aggressive scenarios. And again, as I've mentioned, and as Sergey has pointed out, amidst all of this, our land, water resources are still at threat. And we need to think very carefully about how we put together adaptation measures in a very targeted measures to meet the more pressing threats that we see coming down the pipe. And in the end, what we find most encouraging is that in our most aggressive scenario, we feel very strongly that we can assure the world that we can remain below a very important critical climate target of 2-degree warming. And all of this, again, provides a framework, an assessment that tells us that we can dramatically reduce overall climate risk. This is going to require a lot more detailed analysis at the more granular level, but in the context of this large-scale assessment, it is very encouraging to see that with all of the transformations that we've highlighted in our modeling efforts, we can feel very confident that if we are serious about this issue and the world comes together to make these transformations, we have a very good chance and a very good probability of meeting some very important climate targets. And what I'd like to add at the in closing is that we have in our global change outlook a number of guest contributors that have talked about these points, not only in the context of mitigation and how COVID may affect this, but also that climate targets are not the only story. A climate target doesn't necessarily mean a healthy target. I would encourage you to read through these contributing author sections that gains, I think, a broader perspective of what we ultimately want to achieve is not just a climate conscious world, but also a health conscious world. And with that, I thank you all for your attention. And I believe I need to pass this back to Ron for what I hope will be a lively Q&A discussion. So thank you.
Actually, you're going to pass it to me, and I'll also invite Sergey to turn his video back on. And Adam, stay there. We've got a full panel of, well, not panel. We have a great panel. Adam and Sergey, thank you very much for your presentation. We have several questions in the Q&A. I will select some of those. I also invite our attendees to raise their hand if they would like to ask a question. And if I know you, I may call on you. Arthur, yes, I know you. And Arthur, you have typed in several questions in the Q&A. So instead of trying to select one or go through all, I'm going to just give you the opportunity to talk and address as you'd like.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Anne. And thank you both Sergey and to Adam as well. Always great talk. I guess I don't have a camera, but that's fine. The question I wanted to ask was about precipitation and drought. I think your slide 22, 23 already answered what I had in mind about regional drought. But I'm also still not as familiar with all the CMIP models, the auto models that are out there in CMIP 6. Are we seeing these modeling results still differing in signs for some of the regions in the world in terms of precipitation? Of course, I mean, that would, of course, change the results about whether certain regions are going to be prone to droughts, and certain regions may still have some doubts about droughts. So anyway, can you address that, Adam?
Sure, Arthur, absolutely. Great question. And yes, to your points, I would say that one of the more robust features, sort of emerging patterns, has been that cowl pattern. That's been a fairly salient feature, again, through all the versions of CMIP that we've used for our sort of our hybrid method. And to the points that you've made, and hopefully what one of the slides conveyed, is that even in the version 6, the latest incarnations of all these models and all the experiments that have been done, we still see a spread in the precipitation response at a regional level of detail. And that spread spans across different signs of precipitation trends. And that's certainly a feature that's been fairly consistent through, again, the versions of CMIP. What I will say is, I would say in a sort of a qualitative sense, is that there are certain coherent features of precipitation change that have actually held that's been fairly consistent across the CMIP versions. In particular, the drying that is seen over Europe, that's been a fairly consistent pattern. And it's something, again, in the context of sort of these unsavory combinations of enhanced warming over land and drier conditions during the summer, that, again, this is this sort of double threat that I think, really speaks to, as you say, the concerns about the increased severity of droughts or the increased frequency of droughts. But I don't feel as though, I think just given the way the CMIP models have evolved and the results that we're seeing from CMIP, I think this issue of precipitation trends at a granular level, we're still going to have these challenges of not being able to completely eliminate the probability of precipitation going one way or the other.
Let me just interject, because I'm not sure you would see the chat. I actually bet you wouldn't, because you didn't see mine earlier.
I did not until late.
I'll just note that Susan Solomon wrote that there are places with disagreement and others with robust results. So to get to Arthur's point, there are uncertainties in some places, but they don't apply everywhere.
Which is what I was sort of referring to in terms of the European drawing, is that there are some robust features, but I don't think we're going to be able to completely eliminate it everywhere.
Sounds good. I'll give you a break and move on to Sergey, a question that came in from our friend Keith Alter. Sergey, you noted that the agricultural land use will be stable, and I'm assuming due to continued increases in crop yield. But you model adaptation in farm management to reduce GHG emissions and increases in farm soil carbon sequestration. That's a question. Do you model adaptation?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Well, first of all, my apologies. My camera is not cooperating. So I guess hopefully you'll see at least my picture. And well, that's nice anyway. It's a great question. And I saw that in Q&A, there are several questions which are related to sequestration of carbon in so-called nature-based solutions, so nature climate solutions, and how we account for that. In the scenarios which we used in the Outlook, we did not include these solutions, including pushing for reforestation, pushing for the soil carbon management and others. So in those Excel files, which I have suggested you to look at, we are providing the trajectories for land use related emissions. And you can see that we are reducing them, but we are not really employing them at full scale in Paris to 2 degree or in the Paris to 1.5 degree. I can draw your attention that, well, obviously those nature-based solutions, including soil, including forests, including other management practices, are extremely hot topic and extremely important. And at this point, it's not clear well, what are the driving forces which would be required, not only from the ecological point of view, where you need to take a look at the consideration of water, biodiversity, and other things, but also from socioeconomic and financial and institutional point of view. You're probably familiar with a lot of criticism where you really need to establish a proper baseline in order to do it right. And that's another contentious issue. For example, state of California got some criticism for basically paying for these emission reductions, which would have happened otherwise anyway. And so you have to be really careful with that. To draw your attention to another body of work which we have done on nature-based solution, there is a report where we looked at the sky scenario, which was produced by Shell. And this is where we actually tried to push as much as possible for these nature-based solutions. And if I recall correctly, we are at about 10 gigatons per year of CO2 sinks by 2060. While the sink is exhausted a little bit by the end of the century, getting to 4 gigatons. But that's a very, very different trajectory, because then your net is also very different. And so kind of to answer to your question, so that's a long answer to your question, but indeed, those are important. Nature-based solutions are important. The main thing which we want to stress that using those solutions does not eliminate the need to reduce emissions as much as possible. So those have to be complements. In principle, the scale might be quite large. So I already provide you about 10 gigatons per year. So just to put that in perspective, well, the current emissions from fossil fuels are a little bit more than 30 gigatons. So like 1/3 in terms of the sinks, that's a huge number. But a lot of uncertainties, a lot of things which needs to be in place in order to realize that. Just following up on this point, we also did not include technology which is called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. We have a separate study on that. And again, if you're interested, let me know. I can provide you that, which also provide a huge potential for that, but also a lot of questions. And those are the questions which, again, related to sustainability and other impacts where you go big natural solutions. But it's extremely important to continue researching, and we have actually a couple projects where we are trying to quantify that better and quantify the preconditions for these to materialize. That's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. I'm going to give you just a break and turn to Adam in just a second, but I just note there are several good questions from Richard Moss, but he sent a message saying he had to jump off, and he hopes that you can follow up by email. And I'm going to keep those for you and send that along later. So yes, in fact, to other attendees, if you have questions later, we are certainly happy to answer those. Just let us know. So Adam, I'm going to put you on the spot here. We've got one from Casey Sherman, who you may know. How will these new, more aggressive climate targets affect current approaches to tackling human health challenges?
Thanks for the question, Casey. So as I mentioned in my closing arguments, we are just embarking now on a very deliberate and very important merging, if you will, of these climate targets to more health-oriented targets. So in terms of this particular outlook, we don't really have specific actions or specific metrics that speak to that. But what we hope to do is in the coming years, use the outlook as a basis for making a much more deliberate assessment on health targets.
More to come on that. We're just
More
getting started, right? Turning back to Sergey for a minute. I hope this questionnaire, Juan Carlos is still here. Does the outlook have some estimates of the monetary valuation of physical climate damages at the global scale? Well, that's a tough one.
Yeah, that's a tough one, and I know that Juan Carlos is working on that a lot. So we are looking for his studies when we are trying to get some estimates, especially for the European Union. No, for the outlook, we haven't attempted to do that. Even more than that, as I have mentioned, we haven't looked at all the impacts, and I think Adam has mentioned that we focused on some of them. It's already huge impacts, but there are many others which we haven't really traced. And Adam already alluded, and I think there are a couple of questions which are related to health, climate and health. That's another huge area. We also trying to take a look not only on one global number because or number for a representative agent if you're talking about the economic modeling, but we are also trying to see what we can do in terms of environmental justice, and so that's the term which you can hear a lot. And again, maybe Adam can add that we are currently at least trying to do a pilot project for the US where we are trying to assess the impacts on different categories of the society, on underserved, on the unemployed, or different ages, different income. So that's a critical component. In the models like EPA, in the integrated assessment models, usually that's something which still requires quite substantial advances. So usually we are not that good at taking that at the modeling stage. So, but we are trying to do kind of expanding that, and we have at least one study where we looked at the United States and Spain in terms of the impacts on the population of different income, and we are expanding that into all the regions in the EPA model. But that's something which is still in works. So no, we have not come up with one big number, and as probably Juan Carlos aware, in the US currently there are talks of resurrecting that assessment to come up with the climate damages in order to get to the social cost of carbon calculation. In other words, the current administration is trying to redo that calculation, the famous calculation of, well, $40 per ton of carbon, which has been done before. But that's a much more involved exercise, which we haven't done in this particular research.
Thank you, Sergey. Follow up, you did mention a bit of this earlier, but Claudia, our friend Claudia, has a question, Octaviano, getting deeper into the nature-based solutions. How are carbon removals from natural sinks playing in these different scenarios, both in terms of abatement potential and of costs? Can you say some more?
Right. So definitely our climate model is taking into the account the land sinks and also ocean sinks. Again, in the outlook scenarios, we didn't price, for example, carbon on land, which would resolve into very different solution in terms of the land use and how much land is going to be employed to store carbon. Again, I've alluded to other studies where we do that. So I'll be more than happy to send those studies in order to see what are the magnitudes. So in the outlook, we haven't done that. It's a really important question, which we are addressing currently. We have a couple of projects on that. So again, the story, you have to be really careful because in addition to carbon, these nature-based solutions are bringing other aspects which are in many cases are overlooked, like the implications for native species, the implications for biodiversity, the implications for nitrogen. So many other dimensions where we need to take a much closer look before we can be certain about the potential, and we are not really doing more harm than good when we are pushing that dramatically in different parts of the world.
All right, sir, you can have a sip of water, and I'm going to turn to Adam for a second, even though I've got several more for you, Sergey. Adam, following up on the precipitation modeling results, can you tell us, are they now more consistent in terms of the sign for different climate models from the literature, not from yours specifically?
Well, I think it just goes back to the points that we had made earlier with Arzo's question and as well as Susan's comments. And, you know, I think there's indications, again, that there are more robust signals that are coming out of the latest versions of CMIP and the experiments that they've done and the analysis done. But there remains, again, from region to region, season to season, that there are still going to be challenges about how we can we really pinpoint the sign of precipitation change. And that even becomes, I think, more of a challenge when we think about the regime of precipitation events that we find threatening and damaging, the severe, heavy, extreme precipitation events.
I guess you did answer that mostly already. Sorry for the duplication.
I might just take this opportunity and I just wanted to follow up on Sergey's comments about some of our ongoing projects and how it fits into, again, the very complex nature of risks. You know, this is not just a climate risk issue. These are health risks. There's risks in resources. And to Sergey's points, we have developed under our Department of Energy funding a platform where we are trying to look at all of these risks and to use methods to combine these risks in sort of a quantitative way such that we're developing sort of a landscape of compounding and sort of multi-dimension, multi-dynamic risks, not just based on observations from just the contemporary environment, but then also finding ways to use the information that we've shared with you today from the outlook, to use that information to push those risk metrics forward in time. So looking at all these different scenarios, can we make some more quantitative and visualization messages about how we think all of these compounding risks are coming together? Do we find hotspots? And if we do, that allows us then to exercise more detailed models, I think, to get at a lot of the issues that have been raised here. The challenge is that to exercise the models to get at more complex, again, interrelated and interacting risks, you need very detailed models. These detailed models are very computationally expensive, so you can't run them everywhere under all conditions. You need some sort of, again, a triage or sort of a top level visualization to show you where the hot spots are. And that's sort of a driving force to, I think, a lot of the questions that have been posed earlier about quantifying costs or damages. What are the health implications? What do we do about them? We view this outlook as a first step, an important step, and an important spoke in this whole sort of modeling mechanism to look at these risks in more detail.
And that's a good lead in then. Thank you, Adam. To Sergey, can you, well, actually both of you, could you tell us a little bit more about what are some of the specific accelerated actions that you're contemplating in those scenarios?
Yes. So as I have mentioned in the accelerated actions, we put the announcement which were made on Earth Day in April of this year. Those are not in the formal national determined contributions yet. They are not submitted to the formal process, so those are just announcements. We also have put more aggressive policies for support electric vehicles. So not as aggressive as to just ban internal combustion vehicles, as some are suggesting, but still more support. And also, we also providing more support to increase efficiency in terms of the transportation, and also some solutions which are related to removing emissions from industrial sector. So mostly kind of in terms of the ultimate result, mostly those results in more aggressive economy-wide emission reductions. And so that's where kind of we are saying that the countries needed to put forward much more aggressive targets in comparison to what they have. At the same time, you have to be careful, and I saw that question is from I think from Richard Moss, where we are not taking those promises at face values, and that's indeed very challenging. How much out of what is promised is going to be realized, and how to take that into considerations. And that's a very good point. And we just need to make sure that we are exposing that, we are showing that we need to do more, and we are really pushing for more policies to support not only in US and Europe, where it's a lot of action, but also more policies to push for financial support for technology transfers in developing regions, which are critically needed, those flows, but also the expertise on what these NDCs might be for a lot of developing nations.
Thank you, Sergey. Adam, I'm going to turn to you. So you have a chance to add on to that if you want, but also another Claudia. My apologies for referring to first name only. We've got two Claudias online. Adam, referring to your point about compounding risks, is this risk evaluation framework US or global? I can answer that one, but I won't. And is it process modeling or empirical? But I'll let you take it.
Thanks for the questions, Claudia, and glad to see you joining us today. So to answer your first question, the simple answer is that right now our risk evaluation framework is US, but we are pushing it to global. We're starting in the US for probably some fairly obvious reasons, but ultimately we see this as obviously a framework that needs to be global. And the process or empirical, it's actually, I'd say it's a mixed bag. So we have models that are very process oriented that look at water quality and water availability. So our water modeling resource system is fairly process based. I would say the same would apply to some of the metrics that we have for land. but some of that is going to be empirical. And as we move into, I think, some of the impacts that affect human health, there will be some process modeling in there, particularly when we're just modeling air quality, air chemistry, air pollution. But the impacts on humans obviously are going to rely on empirical-based evidence, any epidemiological evidence that associates quality with deaths and human health impacts. So it's a mixed bag.
Thank you, Adam. Let's see here. Drawing straws. Okay, Carlos, we have someone new let's see. Thanks for the excellent presentation. Based on your experience, which would be the most relevant modeling challenges that we would need to solve in order to improve the certainty of current state-of-the-art climate-related projections? Or is this not an issue?
Well, I think it's always an issue. And, I think the challenge is the push for the scientific community is to get into greater and greater granularity. I think that, that's been around for quite some time. And there is certainly that interest to push the spatial resolution. There is a little bit of the devil is in the details in that as you push higher and higher resolutions, you're requiring the models on a process. So there was this question about what's process level. As you get into higher and higher resolution, there's a lot more that's demanded by models to model the processes, which we can kind of get away with empirical relationships at coarser scales. So, I think there's going to be a challenge that as we push that spatial resolution, we're going to be hitting some new boundaries and some new challenges in how we model that. And really what it comes down to is a model is only as good as much as we understand the environment. And how do we understand the environment? Well, we have to observe it. So there's going to be personally for me, I think we are moving into a point of climate modeling where observations are going to be becoming more and more important, and observations at granularities and for variables that I think we're not normally accustomed to measuring. So that's going to be a big challenge. I think for me personally, I would say that just thinking about all of these risks that we've highlighted today, I think the models to get more and more at extreme events, and I know that's a very broad term, but being able to have models faithfully reproduce events that we know are threatening and are damaging to not just the systems, the resource systems that we covet, but again to just our well-being. Those I think are challenges that are going to be becoming more and more demanding of climate models, and I think that's where a lot of the work should go.
And can I?
Please do. I was just going to call on you. Yes.
Yeah. Well, not on this point, but I saw a message from Arthur Lee on the critical materials, and I thought that it's important to bring that to the attention, what we do about that, and how important to look at that. So just to give you the point of reference, the typical electric car requires 6 times more material inputs in comparison to our conventional car. So, and probably you have heard about the lithium for batteries, but it's not just lithium, because it's much more copper, graphite, nickel, cobalt. So, and in addition, all these elements, when the mining is concentrated in some parts of the world, but the processing, most of that processing is happening in China. And so in addition to the availability at the global scale, there are a lot of issues of the geopolitical influence which are related to scaling up. And it's not only about the electric cars. if you are going to take a look at, for example, offshore wind turbine, so if you're taking a look at the plant of a similar size, so similar capacity, and that offshore wind turbine requires 13 times more of these critical elements, where we need more zinc, we need more copper, manganese, so others. So it's same story. To answer to Arthur's question, to my knowledge, nobody does modeling of these requirements, and especially at the geographic resolution which is needed properly, including us. But that's something which is critically needed. So whenever I see the projections where there is a huge uptake of electric cars, and these considerations are not taking place, and we see over-optimistic projections, we have to be a little bit careful about all the other issues which are related to this switch about these critical materials. It's not that we don't have them, but they are not developed, the mines are not there, and again, there is a geographic concentration of the processing in some particular parts of the world. But that's an extremely important consideration, an extremely important expansion, which we would need to do in order to close that gap in the current modeling. So no one does it good, and there is a good report from IEA on that topic, which illuminates the scale, but we simply don't know. We don't know how to handle that.
Thank you, Sergey. We are just coming up to close. We've got a couple of minutes left. Do either of you have final comments or,
I'll just quickly answer. So Arthur asked a question about the CO2 concentration graphs, and are the other trace gases stabilizing? And that just brings up a broader issue of, these trace gases are resulting in a radiative forcing of the climate system. And so just in a general sense, yes, if you put all the trace gases together into a CO2 equivalent concentration and then translate that into the radiative forcing, yes, in the 2C and the 1.5 degree scenarios, they have to ultimately be stabilized. But other than that, I'll just say thank you for all the questions. This is why we do what we do. It's great to hear everyone's feedback and to talk these through. And I think I speak for Sergey and Ron and everybody, and Ann and everybody involved in this, that it was great to have you here today and to receive all of your great questions.
Sergey, I just wanted, you probably saw a question there. We didn't really touch on it much. And I know we've done a lot of work in the area of distribution of damages and benefits across income groups in the US or developed versus developing countries internationally. Any quick comments you want on that, or do you want to leave it for a follow-up email to Richard Moss?
Yeah, I think it's better. I know that we are approaching the time. Definitely extremely important question about the just transition, environmental justice. So I think we need to explore that more, and we are trying to do more, but it's plenty of area to improvement.
Very good then. On that, I want to thank all of our attendees and of course our presenters. I'm going to put up an email contact on screen in just a moment. If you have follow-up questions, we're happy to receive them and direct them to the right person to answer. So please do. So on behalf of everybody, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.